June 4, 1943. Railroad Street, Mexia, Texas. On this date, 1,850 veterans of the Afrika Korps stepped off a train in central Texas. They were part of the first large wave of German prisoners of war sent to the United States after the surrender in North Africa. They expected cattle cars, harsh guards, and starvation rations. Instead, they were transported in Pullman coaches with padded seats and dining service, watched by curious crowds of American civilians. For many of these men, their greatest shock would not come from prison fences or military discipline, but from something far more ordinary to Americans: the grocery store. In Germany, food was strictly rationed. Since 1939, civilians had lived under a system that allowed only 200 grams of meat per week, 2 pounds of bread, and occasional potatoes or cabbage. Butter, sugar, and coffee were nearly impossible to find. But in 1943, the United States was producing food at an unprecedented scale. That year, American farmers harvested 1.2 billion bushels of wheat, 23 billion pounds of beef, and more than 6 billion pounds of cheese. These surpluses didn't just feed soldiers overseas, they filled supermarket shelves across the country. When men like Otto Reinhardt, a captured infantryman from Hamburg, first glimpsed an American grocery aisle, the sight struck harder than defeat in the desert. Shelves stacked floor to ceiling with canned peaches, bread in bright packaging, and refrigerators humming with milk and butter. To men raised on scarcity, this was not simply food. It was proof of a system Germany could never match. In the summer of 1943, German POWs in Texas witnessed something they had never seen before: a modern American supermarket. The store was brightly lit, open late into the night, and filled with products arranged in orderly aisles. To the prisoners, it looked less like a market and more like an exhibition of industrial power. On a single shelf, there were more loaves of bread than most German villages baked in a week. Brands like Wonder Bread and Sunbeam produced millions of loaves annually, wrapped in wax paper and sliced by machine. In 1943, American bakeries produced over 15 billion pounds of bread, compared to Germany's struggling wartime bakeries, often reduced to stretching flour with fillers like sawdust or turnip meal. Entire aisles displayed canned fruit and vegetables. Labels from companies like Del Monte, Libby's, and Campbell's showed smiling families and bright orchards. The United States canned nearly 4 billion pounds of fruits and vegetables in 1943. In Germany, cans were plain, stamped with ration codes, and almost never available to civilians. Otto Reinhardt recalled seeing a stack of Del Monte peaches in syrup and later wrote, "One tin here was sweeter than a month of rations in Hamburg." The cold cases shocked them most. Refrigerated cabinets displayed bottles of milk, blocks of butter, and cheese in multiple varieties. That year, American dairies produced 55 billion pounds of milk, enough for nearly a quart per person per day. In Germany, milk distribution had collapsed, and children were rationed only a fraction of that amount. Even in wartime, American stores stocked beef, pork, and poultry. Hamburgers and steaks were so common that trimmings and bones were discarded or used for animal feed. The United States produced 23 billion pounds of beef in 1943, while German civilians received less than half a pound of meat per week. For the prisoners, every aisle carried numbers they could barely comprehend. Where Germany calculated survival in grams, America measured production in billions of pounds. What stunned the prisoners next was not just the food itself, but how it was preserved. In Germany, milk spoiled within a day, vegetables rotted quickly, and meat had to be eaten immediately or salted down. In America, refrigeration had changed everything. Inside the supermarkets, cold cases and freezers lined the aisles. There were cartons of ice cream, frozen peas, and entire turkeys sealed in wax paper. Clarence Birdseye's process of flash-freezing food, perfected in the 1920s, had by 1943 become a nationwide industry. That year, more than 250 million pounds of frozen vegetables were sold in American stores, a concept that to German eyes seemed like science fiction. One POW, Karl Weber, later remarked that they had stolen God's seasons. They could eat summer strawberries in January. The abundance extended beyond the stores. Refrigerated rail cars carried beef from Chicago stockyards to cities across the nation, ice-packed fruit from California to New York, and butter from Wisconsin to army bases on the East Coast. By the mid-1940s, the United States operated over 180,000 refrigerated rail cars. A single trainload of chilled beef from the Midwest could feed an entire German city for weeks. In Wisconsin, POWs assigned to dairy farms watched milk poured into stainless steel tanks the size of swimming pools, cooled by electricity, bottled automatically, and shipped in refrigerated trucks to hundreds of stores. In Germany, milk distribution had collapsed under Allied bombing, and by 1944, most urban children received less than half a liter per week. In America, a single cooperative dairy could distribute more milk in a day than entire German regions managed in a month. The contrast could not be ignored. German prisoners had grown up believing hunger was inevitable, a condition of life in Europe's crowded lands. Yet in America, cold machines and endless trains had made hunger optional. By early 1944, groups of German prisoners were assigned to work details near food factories. These were not small workshops or bakeries, but massive industrial plants designed to feed an entire nation. What they saw inside these facilities convinced them that America's food abundance was not luck, but engineering. In Camden, New Jersey, the Campbell Soup Company operated a factory that produced soup on a scale the prisoners could scarcely believe. The plant processed hundreds of tons of tomatoes every day, boiling them in steam kettles and sending them down automated canning lines. In 1943, Campbell's produced more than 200 million cans of soup, enough to feed the population of Germany several times over. A single elderly woman was observed monitoring machinery that filled 300 cans at once, a task that in Germany would have required dozens of men working by hand. In Pittsburgh, the Heinz factory produced ketchup, beans, and pickles around the clock. Conveyor belts ran day and night, filling 20,000 bottles of ketchup a day. By 1943, Heinz was shipping products to every state in America, supported by a workforce that included women and older men who had replaced younger workers sent to the front. To German eyes, the sight of teenagers and housewives keeping a factory running at full speed was both baffling and humiliating. Perhaps the most shocking revelation came from Minnesota, where prisoners encountered the Hormel plant in Austin. Here they watched pork transformed into Spam, the canned meat that had become a staple of Allied armies. In 1943 alone, Hormel produced over 90 million cans of Spam. To German soldiers who lived on thin soup and dry bread, the idea of a meat supply that could be canned, shipped, and eaten anywhere was unimaginable. One prisoner later recalled, "We thought meat had to be hoarded, cut in slivers, or rationed. Here they had made it infinite everywhere the POWs looked. Machines multiplied human effort. Automatic slicers turned out loaves of bread in uniform thickness. Labeling machines wrapped cans in bright paper faster than a man could blink. Even dishwashing was mechanized. For men raised in a Germany where food was rationed by weight and handed out by clerks behind counters, these factories represented an industrial miracle. The conclusion was unavoidable. If America could mobilize such resources for soup, ketchup, and canned meat, then its capacity to feed armies abroad was beyond anything the Reich could match. In late 1943, the prisoners witnessed the scale of America's seasonal holidays. For men raised on rationing, the idea that food could be tied to celebration rather than survival was difficult to understand. Thanksgiving was the first shock. In supermarkets across Texas and the Midwest, refrigerated cases overflowed with turkeys. Some weighed over 20 pounds, large enough to feed a German family for a week. In that year alone, more than 35 million turkeys were raised in the United States, enough for nearly every household that wanted one. Alongside the birds were crates of cranberries, sweet potatoes, and pumpkins, all arranged in displays that turned the grocery store into a festival hall. German prisoners who had eaten only a few ounces of meat per week could scarcely believe that Americans roasted entire turkeys for single families. Christmas was even more disorienting. In December, supermarket aisles filled with candy canes, tins of chocolate, and barrels of peppermint sticks. The Hershey Company alone produced over 500 million candy bars in 1943, while Mars continued to ship Milky Way and Snickers to both civilians and the military. At Camp Hearn in Texas, local church groups sent Christmas packages containing cookies and cakes to the prisoners themselves. They ate sugar and chocolate in quantities that German civilians had not seen since before the First World War. One soldier remarked in a censored letter that he had eaten better as a prisoner in Texas than his children did in Hamburg. Easter added another layer of disbelief. Supermarkets stocked not only eggs, but entire displays of marshmallow chicks and chocolate rabbits wrapped in foil. In 1944, American confectioners produced more than 75 million pounds of Easter candy, even while the nation was fighting a global war. For German soldiers used to telling their children stories about the last piece of chocolate they had seen, the sight of American children discarding half-eaten chocolate animals was unbearable. To the POWs, these holidays made clear that America's abundance was not temporary. It was institutionalized, renewed with each season, and celebrated with rituals that turned supermarkets into the cultural heart of the community. Another revelation came not from the food itself, but from the people inside the supermarkets. In Germany, food distribution reinforced hierarchy. Officers received more than enlisted men, party members had privileges over civilians, and rations varied by class and occupation. But in American supermarkets, the prisoners saw something their ideology had told them was impossible: abundance shared across all groups. Women were at the center of it. Housewives pushed carts down wide aisles, selecting meats, cereals, and vegetables with freedom of choice. Teenage girls worked as cashiers, operating registers and managing money with authority. To German soldiers raised in a culture where women queued for hours with ration cards, the sight of women running entire stores with efficiency was deeply unsettling. Immigrants and minorities added to the shock. Mexican-American farmhands bought sugar and flour for their families. Black families carried baskets filled with fruit, bread, and milk. In warehouses, African-American workers drove forklifts, unloaded trucks, and supervised white prisoners of war without controversy. One German soldier later recalled being told by a black foreman where to stack flour, and what astonished him most was that American guards and workers accepted it without hesitation. Children, too, had access to what in Germany would have been unimaginable luxuries. They bought candy bars for a few cents, drank bottles of Coca-Cola, and ate chewing gum in the streets. In German cities by 1944, children scavenged for coal, shared crusts of bread, and survived on watery soups. The contrast between American children with chocolate and German children in hunger-ravaged cities was among the hardest images for the prisoners to accept. The lesson was unmistakable. In Nazi Germany, food was distributed as a tool of control, reinforcing the hierarchy of the state. In America, food was a right shared across lines of class, race, and gender. The prisoners had been told that democracy was weak and divided. Yet in the grocery aisles of Texas, democracy appeared stronger than the Reich itself. If abundance had already shaken the German prisoners, what came next nearly broke them entirely: the casual waste of food in America. In Kansas City, POWs assigned to a bakery watched hundreds of loaves of bread baked, sliced, wrapped, and stacked on shelves. At the end of the day, unsold bread was thrown into bins and sent for animal feed. A single bakery discarded enough bread daily to feed a German village. One prisoner wrote later that in Hamburg, his family scraped mold from crusts, while in America, pigs ate what Germans could not even dream of tasting. In Wisconsin, prisoners unloading dairy trucks saw spoiled milk poured directly into drains. They begged to drink it, but workers refused, saying it was unsafe. For German soldiers raised in a culture where families boiled sour milk to stretch it another day, the sight of gallons flowing into the gutter was unbearable. California offered the most staggering examples. In the Central Valley, prisoners saw entire truckloads of oranges bulldozed into pits because prices had dropped. Grapes too small for raisins were discarded by the ton, while apples with blemishes were crushed into pulp for vinegar. In 1943, California alone produced over 50 million tons of fruit and vegetables, far more than the nation could consume. To maintain quality and stabilize markets, Americans destroyed what Germans considered treasure. One prisoner later said, "They buried wealth in the ground. They destroyed food to keep its value high." The logic was clear to American farmers. By discarding excess, they kept shelves fresh, ensured prices remained stable, and maintained confidence in the market. But to German eyes, it was a scandal beyond comprehension. Their homeland rationed food by grams, while in America, supermarkets guaranteed abundance by deliberately throwing food away. This realization cut deeper than military defeat. Abundance in America was not just production. It was the ability to waste without fear. Where Germans measured survival by crumbs, Americans measured security by what could be discarded. By late 1944, German prisoners had begun to understand that American abundance was not simply a matter of fertile land or lucky harvests. It was the product of a nationwide system, a web of farms, railroads, warehouses, factories, and supermarkets, all functioning as one. In Nebraska, men working the sugar beet fields saw their harvest loaded directly into rail cars, bound not for local towns, but for refineries hundreds of miles away. Within weeks, the sugar would reappear in bags, stamped with brand names on shelves from Chicago to Dallas. One prisoner observed that in Germany, villages ate what they grew, while in America, villages ate what the nation grew. Railroads were the arteries of this network. In Tennessee, POWs assigned to railway yards saw refrigerated cars filled with beef from Chicago, citrus from Florida, and apples from Washington. By the mid-1940s, the United States operated over 180,000 refrigerated rail cars. A single trainload of beef could feed an entire German city for weeks. To men accustomed to horse carts and coal shortages, the efficiency of American transport revealed a scale of power that no propaganda could conceal. Factories acted as the stomachs of this system. Tomatoes became soup at Campbell's, pork became spam at Hormel, wheat became Wonder Bread in automated bakeries, producing billions of loaves each year. Each factory was connected to farms and distributors, not operating for itself, but as part of a seamless supply chain that ended in the supermarket aisle. To the prisoners, the realization was devastating. The supermarket was not an isolated marvel, but the visible surface of an industrial civilization that had organized itself around feeding its people. Every shelf of milk, bread, and fruit represented thousands of farms, trains, and machines working together. One prisoner later wrote, "Each aisle was a victory parade. Bread, meat, and milk, trophies of a system we could never defeat." As the prisoners grew familiar with American supermarkets, they noticed that food was not only abundant, but also wrapped in a language they had never encountered before: advertising. Every shelf was alive with brands, slogans, and colorful designs that turned groceries into symbols of trust and prosperity. In Germany, wartime rations arrived in plain wrappers stamped with numbers or official seals. Cans were gray, labels minimal, and food was distributed as a matter of survival. In America, every can and box seemed to smile. Campbell's soup labels gleamed red and white. Del Monte peaches carried golden crowns, and Heinz ketchup bottles promised consistency with every serving. Even Spam, once mocked by German soldiers in the field, carried bright blue lettering and confident slogans. Breakfast cereals shocked them most. Instead of plain oats or rye, entire aisles offered Kellogg's Corn Flakes, Wheaties, shredded wheat, and Rice Krispies. The boxes carried mascots, roosters, cartoon boys, and athletes, and some even included toys inside. One prisoner remarked that American children were treated with more care at the breakfast table than German soldiers were at the front. Advertising was everywhere. Billboards showed children eating chocolate bars, families gathered around turkeys, and smiling housewives opening refrigerators. Radio jingles declared, "Wheaties, the breakfast of champions," or "Pepsi-Cola hits the spot." What stunned the prisoners most was that these promises were real. The food existed, the stores were full, and the smiles were genuine. Unlike Nazi propaganda, which often masked scarcity, American advertising mirrored reality. Over time, the prisoners realized that the names themselves carried weight. Campbell's, Heinz, Kellogg's, Hershey's. These brands became institutions, as recognizable in the United States as military leaders or politicians. One POW later joked that while Germany had ministries, America had brands, and the brands seemed to endure longer. What struck them most was the confidence. Every package assumed that the buyer was free to choose. No one was forced to eat a particular bread or soup. Choice itself was part of the message, and it was a kind of democracy made visible. As one soldier admitted after the war, they did not command loyalty. They invited it, and that was stronger. By 1944, some prisoners had spent months on work details that brought them regularly into American towns. They began to notice that supermarkets were more than just places to buy food. They functioned as gathering points, where communities met, exchanged news, and reinforced bonds of daily life. Inside the stores, women lingered in the aisles, comparing recipes, discussing children, and gossiping about local events. What struck the prisoners was the atmosphere. In Germany, ration queues were tense, silent, and filled with suspicion as neighbors watched one another's portions. In America, shopping seemed almost leisurely. People laughed, talked, and moved at ease through aisles that always remained stocked. Near the entrances, many stores had bulletin boards. Instead of official decrees or propaganda posters, these were filled with handwritten notes, offers for piano lessons, farm equipment for sale, church announcements, or notices of community dances. For men accustomed to walls covered in party slogans and military orders, the contrast was startling. A supermarket bulletin board revealed a democracy functioning in miniature. The checkout counters reinforced this impression. Customers stood in line with baskets filled with completely different selections, yet all full. Cashiers, often teenage girls, greeted each shopper, rang up their purchases, and exchanged casual conversation. Magazines, candy bars, and chewing gum lined the registers, making even waiting in line a moment of choice. The German prisoners recognized something that cut deeper than industrial power. Food acted as social glue in America. It brought neighbors together, filled spaces with conversation, and gave even the smallest towns a communal heart. One POW later wrote that the supermarket was like a village within four walls, a place where democracy could be seen not in speeches or flags, but in groceries and human interaction. If the prisoners were unsettled by the sight of women and workers shopping freely, what truly broke their assumptions was watching American children in supermarkets. In Germany, children grew up with ration cards, hunger, and constant shortages. In America, children seemed surrounded by food to the point of taking it for granted. The cereal aisle was the most bewildering. Boxes of Kellogg's, Wheaties, and Rice Krispies carried colorful designs and often promised free toys inside. Prisoners watched in disbelief as children begged their mothers for a particular box, not because of the cereal itself, but for the prize it contained. One soldier remarked bitterly that American children could argue over which toy came in their breakfast, while German children at home were searching rubble for potatoes. Candy reinforced this shock. School children walked into stores with a few coins, emerging moments later with Hershey bars, lollipops, or packs of chewing gum. To the prisoners, chocolate was a distant memory. In Germany by 1944, sweets were so scarce that many children had never tasted them. Yet in America, candy was so common that children sometimes discarded it half-eaten. The discovery of ice cream was another revelation. In many towns, supermarkets were attached to soda fountains, where teenagers bought milkshakes, banana splits, and Coca-Cola floats. German prisoners working nearby saw boys and girls laughing together over treats that in Germany were reserved for the wealthy or the very lucky. One POW later wrote that while German youth were drilled in uniform and hunger, American youth were drinking chocolate ice cream with friends, and it was clear which system would produce stronger generations. The lesson was clear. America's next generation was being raised in a world where food was not a constant struggle, but a source of joy, choice, and even play. To men raised in scarcity, the sight of children chewing gum and trading toys from cereal boxes was more frightening than American tanks. As one prisoner later reflected, they fought us with bombers, but their greatest weapon was their children with full stomachs. By 1945, many German prisoners had spent nearly 2 years in American captivity. They had seen farms stretching to the horizon, factories producing food around the clock, and supermarkets overflowing with goods. Yet one final detail shocked them most. All of this was happening under wartime rationing. The United States had introduced ration books in 1942 for items like sugar, coffee, meat, and gasoline. But unlike in Germany, where rationing meant hunger, in America, the shelves still remained full. Sugar was limited, but candy bars continued to flow from Hershey and Mars. Meat was rationed, yet supermarkets still displayed beef, pork, and poultry in quantities that German civilians could not imagine. Coffee was restricted, but soda fountains served Coca-Cola in nearly every town. The numbers told the story. In 1943, while German civilians received just 200 grams of meat per week, the United States produced 23 billion pounds of beef and 6 billion pounds of pork, even with rationing. American consumers ate several times more meat, sugar, and dairy than their German counterparts. A single American city consumed more butter in a month than all of Berlin's civilian population received in the same period. Prisoners were stunned to learn that rationing in America was as much about fairness as necessity. The government wanted to ensure equal access, not survival on the edge of famine. Supermarket shelves remained stocked, so the public would never doubt that the nation could feed itself and its soldiers at the same time. For the Germans, this was incomprehensible. In their homeland, rationing had been a tool of control and division. In the United States, it became a tool of stability and confidence. For many POWs, this revelation marked the end of any lingering illusions. America's abundance was not temporary or fragile. Even while fighting a global war on two fronts, it had managed to keep its citizens, and even its prisoners, better fed than Germany's own population. As one soldier later admitted, if this was their rationing, then we had already lost. When the war ended in May 1945, more than 370,000 German prisoners prepared to return home. They left behind the camps of Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest, carrying with them memories not only of defeat, but of abundance. Back in Germany, the contrast was immediate. Cities lay in ruins, farms struggled to produce, and millions faced hunger. Between 1945 and 1947, food shortages became so severe that many Germans survived on less than 1,000 calories per day. Bread was dark, thin, and rationed. Meat was scarce. Coffee and chocolate were absent entirely. For the men who had lived as prisoners in America, the memories of full supermarket shelves, bright packaging, and children eating candy bars seemed almost like visions of another world. Some of these prisoners became voices for change in post-war Germany. Farmers who had worked in American fields pushed for mechanization and larger-scale production. Former food industry workers who had seen Campbell's or Heinz plants advocated for more efficient factories. Others carried with them the idea that abundance and choice were not luxuries, but essential parts of a stable society. The legacy became visible in the 1950s. As West Germany rebuilt, supermarkets began to appear, modeled in part on the American examples POWs had described. Chains like Aldi and Edeka grew into national institutions, offering packaged goods, canned foods, and eventually frozen products. The economic miracle of West Germany owed much to American aid, but also to American ideas about production, logistics, and consumer culture. Historians later noted that re-education did not occur only in classrooms or through propaganda. It also happened in grocery aisles. German soldiers had been shown what democracy looked like not in speeches, but in supermarkets where women, immigrants, and children all had the freedom to choose. They had been taught, silently but powerfully, that prosperity came from cooperation, not conquest. One former prisoner summarized it years later. We had been told that strength came from order and discipline, but in America, We saw that strength came from full shelves, from freedom of choice, from food shared by all. That lesson stayed with us longer than the war itself. The German POWs had arrived in America as soldiers of scarcity. They left as witnesses to abundance. And in the years that followed, their memories of those supermarket aisles would help shape not only their own lives, but the rebirth of Germany as a modern consumer society.